the blueprint of redemption. The train wheels ground against steel rails with a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. Sergeant Marcel Dubois pressed his face against the cold window of the cattle car, watching the German countryside roll past in the grey light of dawn. June 1940. The acrid smell of unwashed bodies and fear had long since stopped bothering him. But something else drifted through the cramped space now, the rich aroma of coffee brewing somewhere ahead. Real coffee. Not the chicory substitute they'd been drinking in the trenches before the collapse. Marcel's fingers traced the outline of his identification tags through his torn uniform. 3 weeks ago, he'd been carrying a MAS-36 rifle through the forests near Sedan, believing in French superiority and the invincibility of the Maginot Line. Now he was prisoner number 47,891, headed toward a camp whose name he couldn't pronounce. The train shuddered to a halt. German voices shouted orders outside, and the heavy doors slid open with a metallic screech. Sunlight flooded the car, and Marcel squinted as guards gestured for the prisoners to disembark. The coffee smell grew stronger, mixing with the scent of fresh bread that made his empty stomach clench. "Raus, schnell!" a young German corporal commanded, but his voice lacked the brutality Marcel had expected. The guard looked barely old enough to shave, and when Marcel stumbled on the platform, the boy instinctively reached out to steady him. Their eyes met for a moment, brown eyes meeting blue, and Marcel saw something unexpected. Not hatred or contempt, but a flicker of recognition. One soldier seeing another. The camp spread before them like a small town, with neat wooden barracks arranged in rows and a kitchen building from which that impossible coffee aroma continued to drift. Prisoners in faded uniforms moved between the buildings with purpose, not the broken shamble Marcel had imagined. Some carried tools, others books. A few were even laughing. "This way," the young guard said in careful French, gesturing toward the processing building. His accent was thick but understandable. Marcel joined the line of new arrivals, each man receiving a bowl, a spoon, and a thin blanket that smelled of soap instead of misery. When his turn came, the German clerk behind the table looked up from his ledger and asked, "Trade or profession?" "Infantry, sergeant," Marcel replied automatically. "No," the clerk shook his head with what might have been amusement. "Before the war. What did you do before the war?" Marcel hesitated. I worked in an armament factory in Lyon." The clerk made a note and handed him a piece of paper with a barracks assignment. As Marcel turned to leave, the man called after him in French that was surprisingly fluent. "The coffee is real here. German civilians donate it through the Red Cross. You might find that unexpected." That evening, Marcel sat on his assigned bunk, staring at the tin cup of coffee a fellow prisoner had brought him from the mess hall. Steam rose from the dark liquid, carrying an aroma that reminded him of Sunday mornings in Lyon, of his wife Claire reading the newspaper aloud while he sketched improvements to rifle designs at their kitchen table. The coffee was indeed real, rich and bitter and impossibly generous for a prisoner of war camp. Marcel lifted the cup to his lips and paused, remembering the propaganda posters back home that showed German soldiers as monsters, subhumans incapable of mercy or civilization. "Drink it," advised the man in the next bunk, a tank commander named Laurent, who'd been captured near Arras. "I struggled with it too the first week, but starving yourself won't make it taste less German." Marcel took a sip. The coffee was better than anything he'd tasted in months, and that realization settled in his stomach like a stone. If they were wrong about something as simple as coffee, what else might they be wrong about? Outside the barracks windows, he could see the young guard from the train walking his patrol route, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The boy was humming something under his breath, a melody Marcel didn't recognize, but somehow found comforting. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man reconcile the taste of kindness with everything he was taught to believe? The routine at Stalag VB was nothing like the chaos Marcel had expected. Reveille at 6, followed by roll call in the central yard, where German officers counted prisoners with the methodical precision of accountants rather than the cruelty of conquerors. Breakfast was thin but regular. Dark bread, ersatz coffee, and sometimes a pat of margarine that the guards distributed without commentary or spite. Marcel found himself assigned to the camp's workshop, where prisoners repaired furniture and manufactured small goods for the German military. The irony wasn't lost on him that after designing weapons to kill Germans, he was now fixing their chairs and tables. The workshop supervisor, Hauptmann Weber, was a middle-aged man with calloused hands who had clearly worked with tools long before the war. "You understand machinery?" Weber observed on Marcel's third day, watching him examine a broken lathe with professional interest. "This is good. We have much work to do." The other prisoners in the workshop came from across Europe: French, Belgian, Polish, even a few British pilots shot down during the evacuation from Dunkirk. They worked quietly, efficiently, under the supervision of German guards who seemed more interested in production quotas than ideological persecution. During lunch break, Marcel sat with Laurent and a Polish cavalry officer named Kowalski, sharing the thin soup and bread while rumors circulated about the war's progress. The guards had allowed prisoners to receive letters, and news filtered in through families still in occupied France. "My sister writes that the Germans have set up proper administration in Paris," Laurent said quietly. "The shops are open. People are working. It's not the devastation we expected." "They're being smart about it," Kowalski replied, keeping his voice low. "Why destroy what they can use?" Marcel thought about his own letter from Claire, which had arrived that morning after 6 weeks of silence. She wrote of rationed coffee and limited food, but also of German officers who spoke French and German soldiers who helped elderly women carry their shopping. It wasn't the picture of savage occupation he'd been trained to expect. That afternoon, Hauptmann Weber approached Marcel's workstation with a blueprint, a technical drawing of a rifle bolt mechanism that made Marcel's breath catch in his throat. "You know this weapon?" Weber asked, pointing to the schematic. Marcel stared at the familiar lines of the MAS-36's bolt action, the straight pull design he had helped refine during his years at the Lion Armament Works. His own fingerprints were metaphorically all over this design, the weapon he'd been so proud to see adopted by the French army. "Yes," Marcel answered carefully. "I know this rifle." Weber nodded. "We have captured many of these. Superior design to our Mauser in some ways. The straight pull action allows for faster sustained fire than our turnbolt system. We are studying them." The admission hit Marcel like a physical blow. The Germans weren't just using captured French rifles. They were learning from them, incorporating French innovations into their own weapons development. The rifle he'd helped create, France's supposed technological edge, was teaching the enemy how to kill more efficiently. "You worked on this design," Weber continued, apparently oblivious to Marcel's internal turmoil. "The bolt mechanism," Marcel admitted. "I helped solve problems with the extractor system during development." Weber's eyebrows rose slightly. "Impressive work. The extraction cycle is very smooth, even with different ammunition types. Much better than our early attempts at straight pull actions." That evening, Marcel lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling while other prisoners wrote letters or played cards in the dim electric light. The workshop supervisor's casual praise echoed in his mind, professional recognition from a man who should have been his mortal enemy. The young guard from the train, Marcel had learned his name was Klaus, made his evening rounds, checking each barracks with efficient politeness. When he reached Marcel's section, he paused. "The coffee tomorrow will be stronger," Klaus said in his careful French. "Red Cross shipment arrived today, real beans from Brazil." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcel asked. Klaus considered the question seriously. "Because you looked sad today, in the workshop. Coffee helps with sadness, I think." After the guard left, Marcel pulled out paper and began composing a letter to Claire, but instead of writing about the coffee or the unexpected kindness or the civilized conditions, he found himself crafting careful lies about German brutality and his own unwavering resistance. The truth felt too dangerous to commit to paper, dangerous not because the Germans might read it, but because it contradicted everything that made sense about the world. Outside, Klaus continued his patrol, still humming that unknown melody that somehow made the barbed wire seem less like a cage and more like the boundaries of a strange, temporary country where enemies could discuss rifle mechanisms over broken furniture and real coffee. Letters from home arrived irregularly, but when they came, they transformed the camp's atmosphere. Marcel watched grown men weep over news of children taking first steps or wives managing farms alone. The mail call had become a ritual of hope and heartbreak, conducted by Klaus and the other guards with surprising gentleness. Marcel's third letter from Claire arrived on a cold morning in September, carried in an envelope that had clearly been opened and resealed by censors. But the contents remained intact, and Claire's words painted a picture of occupied France that continued to challenge everything Marcel thought he knew about war. The German officer quartered in the Dubois house down the street speaks perfect French and helps Madame Dubois with her shopping, Claire wrote. He brings chocolate for her grandchildren and fixes things around the house that her late husband never could manage. The children call him Uncle Heinrich and teach him French songs. I know this sounds strange, but I wonder sometimes if we have more in common with these people than our leaders wanted us to believe. Marcel folded the letter carefully, but not before Laurent glimpsed a few lines. "Your wife is observant," Laurent said quietly. "My last letter mentioned similar things. German soldiers sharing their rations with hungry French children, officers ensuring that churches remain open for services." "It's propaganda," interrupted Sergeant Beaumont, an older man who'd become the self-appointed guardian of French honor in their barracks. "They're trying to make us soft, make us forget what they are." "What are they exactly?" asked Kowalski, looking up from his own letter. "Because I've been here 3 months, and I haven't seen the monsters we were promised." Beaumont's face flushed. "They're the enemy. They invaded our countries, killed our comrades. Don't let a little coffee and politeness make you forget that." The argument might have escalated, but Klaus appeared in the doorway for evening count. As the prisoners lined up, Marcel noticed the young guard's hands. They were stained with ink, and a small notebook protruded from his breast pocket. After lights out, Marcel approached Klaus during his patrol rounds. "You write letters too?" Marcel asked in careful German, words he'd been learning from Weber in the workshop. Klaus looked surprised, then nodded. "To my mother. In Hamburg. She worries." "What do you tell her? About us?" The question clearly made Klaus uncomfortable. He glanced around, then stepped closer to Marcel's bunk. "I tell her that French soldiers are like German soldiers. They miss their families. They work hard. They are not so different." "And what does she think of that?" Klaus was quiet for a long moment. "She says this is not what the newspapers tell people, but she trusts what I see with my eyes." The next day in the workshop, Marcel worked alongside a new arrival, a French engineer named Petit, who'd been captured during the retreat from Paris. Petit had worked at the Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, the state arsenal where the MAS-36 had been produced. "You helped design this rifle?" Petit asked when Weber showed them another captured MAS-36 for study. "My compliments. The production techniques required for this straight-pull bolt were challenging, but the results were worth it." Weber overheard the conversation and joined them at the workbench. "We have implemented some of your innovations in our new weapons. The extraction timing particularly, very elegant solution to a complex problem." Marcel stared at the rifle in Weber's hands, recognizing specific details he'd sketched in his Lion workshop years ago. But now German hands held it, German eyes studied it, German minds learned from it. The weapon he'd created to defend France was teaching its enemies how to perfect their own instruments of war. "Does this trouble you?" Weber asked, noting Marcel's expression. "Should it not?" Weber considered this seriously. In my peacetime job, I am an engineer for Krupp, steel production mostly. Good steel has no nationality. It is simply good steel. Perhaps good design is the same way. That evening, as Marcel wrote another carefully sanitized letter to Claire, he found himself struggling with Weber's words. If technical excellence transcended borders, what did that mean about loyalty, about patriotism, about the very notion of enemies? Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Outside, Klaus walked his patrol route, notebook in hand, writing words that would somehow find their way to Hamburg, carrying truths that newspapers couldn't print. When does professional pride become a betrayal of everything you once believed? Winter arrived at Stalag VB with German efficiency, extra blankets distributed before the first snow, additional heating stoves installed in the barracks, and a change in the kitchen routine that produced heartier soups and more substantial bread rations. Marcel had expected the cold months to bring hardship, but instead found himself warmer and better fed than he'd been during the last winter before the war. The workshop had become his refuge, a place where the complexities of captivity dissolved into the simple mathematics of mechanical problems. Weber had begun consulting him on increasingly sophisticated projects, and Marcel found genuine satisfaction in the work, despite its implications. "We have a special assignment," Weber announced one December morning, producing a wooden crate marked with technical specifications. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay components for what Marcel immediately recognized as an experimental rifle mechanism, German engineering attempting to incorporate the straight-pull principles of the French MAS-36. "The prototype jams during rapid fire," Weber explained, laying out the parts on the workbench. "Our engineers believe the timing of the extraction cycle is incorrect, but they cannot determine the proper adjustment." Marcel studied the mechanism with professional interest, noting where German manufacturing techniques had misunderstood the subtle tolerances required for smooth operation. The fix was obvious to anyone who'd spent years perfecting the original French design, but explaining it felt like crossing a line he'd never imagined approaching. "I cannot ask you to help improve weapons that might be used against your countrymen," Weber said quietly. "But as one engineer to another, I am curious about your assessment." The moral dilemma kept Marcel awake that night. In the next bunk, Laurent tossed restlessly, fighting his own dreams. Across the aisle, Klaus made his rounds with unusual quiet, as if sensing the tension that had settled over the barracks like winter fog. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A Red Cross inspector had arrived, a Swiss doctor named Friedrich Zimmermann, who spoke French, German, and English with equal fluency. His presence sent ripples of nervous energy through both prisoners and guards, as if everyone suddenly remembered they were playing roles in a larger drama. Dr. Zimmermann was a small man with careful eyes who observed everything without appearing to judge anything. He interviewed prisoners privately, examined the barracks, the workshop, the kitchen, and the medical facilities with methodical thoroughness. When he reached Marcel, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "You were involved in weapons design before the war?" Zimmermann asked, consulting a clipboard that somehow contained more information about Marcel's background than should have been possible. "Yes, sir. Small arms development." "And now you work in the camp workshop, repairing furniture and studying captured weapons?" Marcel hesitated. "Sometimes, yes." Zimmermann made a note, then looked up with eyes that seemed to see through carefully constructed facades. "This must create certain conflicts for you." "I don't understand, sir." "A man who designs weapons to kill Germans, now helping Germans understand those same weapons. The irony is considerable." That afternoon, Marcel watched through the workshop window as Dr. Zimmermann concluded his interviews with the guards. Klaus emerged from the commandant's office looking pale and shaken, his usual composure replaced by something that looked like shame. Weber approached Marcel's workbench with the German prototype rifle mechanism, but this time his expression was different, less collegial, more formal. "The inspection has reminded us all of certain boundaries," Weber said carefully. "Perhaps it would be best if you return to furniture repair." But Marcel was staring at the flawed German mechanism, seeing not an enemy weapon but an engineering puzzle, crying out for solution. The extraction timing was wrong by perhaps 3 millimeters, a tiny adjustment that would transform a jamming prototype into a reliable rifle that could fire as fast as a soldier could work the bolt. "The spring tension needs to be reduced by approximately 15%, Marcel said quietly. "And the bolt face requires a slight modification to the extractor groove, perhaps 1/10 of a millimeter deeper with a 15-degree angle change." Weber's pencil moved automatically, recording the specifications even as his face registered shock at what Marcel was revealing. "Why?" Weber asked simply. Marcel looked at the mechanism, then at Weber, then through the window where Klaus continued his patrol with mechanical precision. "Because good design has no nationality. You taught me that." That evening, Dr. Zimmermann requested a final interview with Marcel. They sat in the camp's small medical facility, speaking in low voices while snow began falling outside the windows. "You have helped them improve weapons," Zimmermann observed. It wasn't a question. "I answered technical questions, nothing more." "And how do you justify this to yourself?" Marcel considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure I can, but I'm also not sure that hatred makes more sense than understanding." Zimmermann closed his notebook and studied Marcel with those penetrating eyes. "You may find, when this war ends, that such understanding comes with a price. People prefer their enemies to remain enemies. It makes the world simpler." Outside, Klaus completed his rounds and returned to the guardhouse, where he would write another letter to Hamburg, carrying truths that grew more complicated with each passing day. Can a man serve two masters, conscience and country, when they demand different things? The revelation came not through grand confession or dramatic confrontation, but through a forgotten notebook left on Weber's desk in the workshop. Marcel noticed it while organizing tools after the morning shift, its leather cover worn smooth by constant handling. The pages fell open to detailed sketches and specifications, not for furniture or camp equipment, but for weapons. German weapons, incorporating French innovations with methodical precision. Marcel found page after page of his own suggestions transcribed in Weber's careful handwriting, accompanied by calculations and modifications that could only have come from extensive testing. The notebook contained months of collaboration, disguised as casual conversation, technical expertise extracted through discussions that had felt like professional courtesy between engineers. But it was the final entry that stopped Marcel's breath entirely. Weber had written in French, "Subject 47891, Marcel Dubois, has provided critical insights into MAS-36 extraction timing. Recommend implementation across all new rifle production. Subject appears willing to continue consultation, believing technical knowledge transcends national boundaries. This perspective could prove valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts." Marcel was still staring at the notebook when Weber returned from lunch. "You were not meant to see that," Weber said quietly, but he made no move to retrieve the notebook. "How long?" Marcel asked. "How long have you been recording our conversations?" "From the beginning. It is my assignment." The words hit Marcel like a physical blow. Every discussion about rifle mechanisms, every shared insight about metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances, every moment of professional camaraderie had been intelligence gathering. He had been systematically betrayed by his own expertise and enthusiasm. "You used me." Weber sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "Yes, and you used me as well, whether you realized it or not. You gained access to German weapons development, observed our manufacturing techniques, learned about our production capabilities. When you return home, This information will be valuable to French intelligence. The observation was accurate and somehow made the betrayal worse. Marcel had indeed been gathering intelligence, almost unconsciously, filing away details about German industrial capacity and technological approaches that would matter after the war. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" Marcel asked. "Our discussions, the respect you showed for French engineering?" Weber was quiet for a long moment. "Everything, all of it, which is why this assignment has become difficult." That evening, Marcel sat on his bunk holding a letter from Claire that had arrived with the afternoon mail. She wrote about German soldiers helping to repair the village church, about shared Christmas celebrations where French children sang carols for Wehrmacht officers who responded with German songs their own children might be learning. "I received a visit from Colonel Schneider last week." Claire's letter continued. "He brought news of you. Apparently the Red Cross maintains some communication with prisoner camps. He seemed genuinely concerned about your welfare and mentioned that you were working in a technical capacity. He spoke of you with respect, almost admiration. I found this confusing. Are we supposed to hate people who show such humanity?" Laurent read over Marcel's shoulder, then shook his head slowly. "They're playing a long game, making us comfortable, making us compliant. When the war ends, they want us to remember kindness instead of conquest." "Maybe," Marcel replied. "Or maybe people are just more complicated than our propaganda allowed us to believe." Sergeant Beaumont approached from across the barracks, his face hard with disapproval. "I've been watching you, Dubois, working closely with the Germans, having friendly conversations with the guards. Some might call that collaboration. And what would you call it? Treason. You're helping them improve weapons that will kill Frenchmen." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Other prisoners had stopped their evening activities to listen, creating a circle of judgment that felt like a military tribunal. "I answered technical questions," Marcel said carefully. "Nothing more. Technical questions about French rifle design, information they're using to build better weapons." Klaus appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. His presence seemed to intensify the confrontation, transforming an internal French dispute into something that involved the enemy directly. "Is there a problem?" Klaus asked in French. Beaumont turned to face the young guard directly. "Yes, we have a collaborator in our midst." Klaus looked genuinely confused. "Collaborator? I do not understand this word." "Someone who helps the enemy," Beaumont explained with bitter satisfaction. "Someone who betrays his country for better food and warmer blankets." Marcel saw something change in Klaus's expression. Not anger or triumph, but sadness. The young guard looked at Marcel with what might have been disappointment, then spoke quietly to Beaumont. "Sergeant Dubois helps repair broken things. This is not collaboration. This is work. All prisoners' work. He helps improve German weapons." Klaus was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, and I learn French songs from prisoners. And Weber learns about French engineering from technical discussions. And Dr. Zimmermann learns about this camp from interviews. Everyone learns from everyone. This is not betrayal. This is how people live together without killing each other." The simple observation settled over the barracks like a benediction. Klaus continued his rounds, leaving the prisoners to confront the implications of his words in silence. That night, Marcel dreamed of his workshop in Lyon, where he'd spent countless hours perfecting the MAS-36's bolt mechanism. In the dream, German soldiers carried rifles he'd designed, but so did French soldiers, and American soldiers, and soldiers from countries he'd never heard of. The weapons had no nationality, no ideology, no hatred. They were simply tools that worked exactly as he'd intended them to work. When he woke, Marcel understood that he would carry this complexity for the rest of his life, the knowledge that expertise could be both gift and betrayal, that understanding could be both bridge and treason, and that the truth was always harder to live with than simple hatred. What happens to a man when he discovers his greatest skill has been turned against everything he once believed in? The end came not with liberation armies or dramatic escapes, but with a typed notice posted in the barracks on a grey April morning in 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Arrangements were being made for repatriation. Marcel stared at the announcement, feeling not triumph, but a strange emptiness. After 11 months in Stalag VB, the prospect of returning home carried as much anxiety as relief. What would he tell Claire about the coffee and the kindness? How would he explain Weber's respect or Klaus's humanity to people who needed their enemies to remain monsters? The camp's atmosphere shifted overnight. Guards who had been colleagues became prisoners in their own right, awaiting uncertain fates. Weber appeared in the workshop one last time, not to supervise, but to say goodbye. "I wanted to thank you," Weber said formally, "for the technical assistance and for treating me as an engineer rather than an enemy." Marcel looked around the workshop where they'd spent so many hours discussing metallurgy and mechanical tolerances, finding common ground in the universal language of precision and craftsmanship. "What will happen to you?" "Interrogation, most likely. Then reconstruction work if I'm fortunate. Germany will need engineers to rebuild what the war destroyed." Weber produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For your journey home, something to remember that not all German gifts contain poison." Inside was a bar of Swiss chocolate, real chocolate that must have cost Weber a significant portion of his personal rations. Marcel turned the package over in his hands, feeling its weight, remembering the first cup of coffee that had challenged everything he'd believed about captivity and enemies. "Why?" Marcel asked. "Because you fixed broken things, and because understanding is rarer than hatred." Klaus appeared for the final prisoner count, but his usual efficiency was replaced by obvious reluctance. When he reached Marcel, the young guard hesitated. "I have something for you also," Klaus said quietly, producing his small notebook. "Letters I wrote but never sent, about what I saw here, about French soldiers and Polish soldiers and British soldiers who were just soldiers. My mother says I should save these letters, for when people ask what really happened in places like this." Marcel accepted the notebook, its pages filled with Klaus's careful German script. Even without translation, he could sense the humanity in these unsent letters, testimony to complexity in a world that preferred simplicity. "What will you tell people?" Klaus asked. "About us? About here?" "I don't know," Marcel admitted. "The truth is harder to explain than lies." 3 days later, Marcel stood in the courtyard of a French repatriation center, wearing a new uniform and carrying official papers that restored his identity as Sergeant Marcel Dubois, French Army. The processing officer asked routine questions about his captivity, clearly expecting routine answers about German brutality and French resistance. "Physical condition? Good. Well-fed and properly housed." The officer looked up with surprise. "Well-fed? In a German prison camp?" Marcel hesitated, then nodded. The guards provided adequate rations, sometimes better than adequate. "Treatment by enemy personnel?" Another pause. "Professional. Correct according to international conventions." "Any collaboration by French personnel with enemy forces?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Marcel thought about Weber's notebook, about his own willing participation in technical discussions, about the impossible complexity of human relationships that transcended national boundaries. "Not to my knowledge," Marcel answered. That evening, he wrote his first letter home as a free man, but found himself crafting the same careful lies he'd written from the camp. Claire wanted to hear about German cruelty and French heroism, not about coffee and chocolate and young guards who hummed unknown melodies during night patrol. The train to Lyon departed at dawn, carrying him through a landscape scarred by war, but already showing signs of recovery. At every stop he saw German prisoners working alongside French civilians, to repair damaged rail lines and bombed bridges. Former enemies laboring together with the practical cooperation he'd learned to expect but could never explain to people who hadn't witnessed it themselves. Claire met him at Lyon Station, and for a moment they stood apart, studying each other like strangers. The woman who had written about German officers helping with shopping seemed different from the woman who now waited for confirmation that her husband remained unchanged by captivity. "You look well," she said carefully. "I was treated well." "By the Germans?" Marcel nodded and saw something shift in Claire's expression, not disappointment but recognition. She had lived under occupation while he had lived in captivity, and both had discovered that reality was more complex than propaganda. That night, they sat in their kitchen while Marcel unpacked his few belongings. Claire noticed the chocolate bar immediately. German chocolate? A gift from the workshop's supervisor. Claire examined the wrapper carefully, as if searching for hidden meanings. "Was he kind to you?" "He was professional, respectful. He treated me like an engineer rather than a prisoner." "And how did that make you feel?" Marcel considered the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Confused, grateful, guilty for being grateful. Claire unwrapped the chocolate and broke off a small piece, offering it to Marcel. He hesitated, then accepted it, the sweetness carrying memories of workshop conversations and technical discussions that had blurred the line between collaboration and understanding. Years later, when people asked about his war experience, Marcel would speak of hardship and resistance, giving them the stories they needed to hear. But in quiet moments, usually late at night when the house was still, he would remember Weber's respect and Klaus's humanity. He would taste that Swiss chocolate and remember that understanding had been harder to carry than hatred, but ultimately more honest than simple answers to complicated questions. The notebook Klaus had given him remained hidden in his workshop, testimony to complexity that the world wasn't ready to acknowledge. Sometimes Marcel would read the young guard's careful German script and wonder if Klaus had found peace in Hamburg, if Weber had found work rebuilding Germany, if any of them had learned to live with the knowledge that enemies could be human. In the end, Marcel realized, the war had taught him that the most dangerous weapon wasn't the rifle he'd helped design, but the capacity for understanding that threatened to make hatred impossible. It was a burden he would carry in silence, because the truth about human complexity was harder to bear than comfortable lies about inevitable enmity. The chocolate was long gone, but its sweetness lingered in memory, a reminder that mercy had been real, even when no one wanted to remember it. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How do you carry the memory of kindness from people you were taught to hate?